Welcome back to a Slice of Empathy podcast. Today we have a very special guest who is Pete Cruz, and he'll be sharing his deeply personal journey of healing and recovery through his powerful memoir, No Tears for Dad, My Path to Forgiveness. This book will take readers through Pete's experiences with childhood trauma and how he found solace and strength through his Heavenly Father. His story of perseverance and resilience, navigating the complexities of adult life while battling depression, PTSD, anger management, chronic pain, fears of failure and abandonment, challenges that many survivors of trauma and our listeners will relate to. But Pete's path to forgiveness and healing will offer hope to those who are just starting their own recovery or have already walked down that path. Raised in Milpitas, California, Pete holds a bachelor's degree in English from the California State University, Sacramento, and has made significant contributions to adult education as a trainer and consultant for the state of California. He's also an award-winning short story writer, editor, and speaker who has participated in numerous writers' panels, talks, and workshops. I'm so excited to dive into Pete's story, discuss his journey, and learn how his faith helped him find a path to forgiveness. Let's welcome Pete Cruz to the show. So I'm super excited to have you join me today. I had the privilege of course, reading your book before it officially came out. But let's start off. If you could tell us a little bit about your book, what motivated you to write it. We can start from there.
My book is basically a memoir of my life, and it details a difficult childhood and how I basically survived and came out of it and turned out to be an all right person in the end. So what motivated me to write it was basically my daughter. I come from an abusive, severely abusive, physically, mentally abusive background. And my daughter had to grow up with someone like me who was depressed and angry. And I knew someday I had to write it because I wanted her to understand that despite everything that happened, I tried my best to be a good father and didn't mean and tried not to be the way I was, but it was the only thing I knew from how I grew up because my own father was an angry man, and that's all I knew. And that's how my daughter grew up with me. And so I wrote it for my daughter.
Love that. Can you describe maybe some of the impact of your father's abusive behavior and maybe one of the earliest memories that you included in your book and maybe how it kind of set that tone for your childhood?
Oh, one of the early scenes in my book was I was maybe 4 or 5 years old, and we lived on a farm, and one of my daily duties was to feed the chickens. And we had a chicken coop, and my dad would escort me out to the chicken coop, and he'd open the door to the coop and close it in after me. And the smell of chicken poop was strong, and the chickens were in a frenzy, so it was really noisy. But in the back of the coop was a rooster, and he was the king of the roost. And every day I'd walk in, he would just stare at me. And then I would try to make my way around the coop and feed. And at some point, the chicken, and I'm only 5 years old, and the rooster seemed like he was half my size. And at some point, he would attack me and fly through the air, and I'd turn my back to him and feel his talons in my back. And this happened literally every day, and my dad would see it, and he had to know how terrified I was, and yet he did nothing. And I think what set the tone for me was I couldn't cry out because I was afraid of what my dad would do if I didn't want to do the job. So I never cried out. And I think it occurred to me that despite the pain of feeling the rooster's talons in my back and being attacked daily, I was more afraid of my dad than the rooster.
Yeah, that is so profound. And I think that is just such a memory, especially when we think about writing and writing these experiences. Was there anything that you found specifically challenging as you were writing your memoir? Did you feel like it was maybe reopening old wounds, or did you maybe find it like more therapeutic when going through, especially these more detailed and traumatic events?
Yeah. My book, especially the first part of my book, is a difficult read. I mean, I've been told that many times because someone will read it and they'll just say to themselves, how could this happen to a child? It was difficult writing it too, because I had to relive the experience. And even in that rooster scene, smelling the sulfuric smell of chicken poop and, remembering just walking in silence with my dad. There were times when tears were streaming down my face as I'm just trying to write it, and myself thinking, how could this happen to me? And what got me through, frankly, was God, because I would write it practically every day. I'd write and I'd feel Jesus Christ at my shoulder and get the impression that he was saying, I'm right here with you. And somehow each day that made me want to write more, because I got to feel the presence of God next to me. So, and he meant it for me to have a catharsis in the writing, just to get it all out, because basically my body and mind was just storing trauma. And people have told me that I seemed to change after I wrote the book, and it got it all out. And that was another purpose God had for me, just to get it all out.
So powerful. I love that you mentioned that, because I think, and you mentioned something very important of feeling like an outsider looking in. And I think many of our listeners, myself included, have maybe had similar experiences where we look back, like some years have maybe separated us from like the event. And we look back and we're just like, wow, I can't believe that happened. And it's almost like this belief that in a way you're thinking that I can't believe this happened to me. It's almost like it's another person. And so I really appreciate that you mentioned that, because I think so many folks can relate to that, especially when we're thinking about trauma, especially when there's so much time that's separated from it. And in a way, I think we can become numb to it, and it could take some years to really process it. And I like that you mentioned that in a way, having those emotions as you're writing, and also having kind of like that, not necessarily just reliving it, but also like having some therapy in a way in writing it. And I know for like so many different writers, myself included, writing for me has been therapeutic. I've been writing for a long time as well. And it's been something that like has helped me get through some difficult times. So I really appreciate you mentioning that. And another detail I really want to touch on is that in your book, it's highlighted the three belts that are hanging in your dad's closet as a symbol of fear and control. Can you maybe elaborate on a specific incident involving those belts that you described in your book?
Yeah, there was a incident where I can't remember how old I was. I was still a teenager. I'm thinking maybe I was 15, 14, 15. A friend of mine invited me to his house after school to play. We were going to play baseball with his brothers, and I was so looking forward to it. Yet I lived the kind of life where I wasn't supposed to do anything after school except stay home and do chores. And in this particular case, we didn't have a dryer, so we hung our laundry indoors on a line. And I'm hanging up the laundry and I asked my dad if I could go afterward to my friend's house. And he said no. And I couldn't hide the disappointment in my face. And, by then I'd already learned not to show emotion on my face. Otherwise it'd get me in trouble. But I was so disappointed that I knew that I couldn't hide it. And my dad looked at me and he yelled at me and said, "What? You don't like that?" And then he literally sprinted to his closet and got one of his belts. And there were three of them. One was thick, one was medium, and one was thin. And I'd usually think, please don't get the thin one because that one hurts. It's like a whip and it would tear at my skin. And yet that was the one he got. And he just started whipping me. And, I'm fending myself off with my arms and it's still getting through like on my neck and stuff like that. And, those are sometimes in writing the book, it's not that hard to remember what happened because things like that are so vivid that they remain in your head as if it was just last week or something. So that's one of the belt stories.
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate you sharing that with us. And I wanted to touch on something you mentioned, which was the need to show lack of emotion, because I think that so many trauma survivors experience this. And I know for me personally, I remember when I was younger, I had learned something similar and to not really show how I was feeling because it would inconvenience my parents and I didn't want to inconvenience them because I didn't know what was gonna happen. So for me, like I remember one crucial time when I was in middle school and there was a homicide with a family that was at my school, and the girl had passed away, and they had this kind of memorial set up for her. And I remember one of my classmates asking me like why I wasn't showing any sort of emotion, why wasn't I crying, and that was something that really stuck with me. Like I was just like I didn't show like emotion like at all from a pretty early age. And then I remember not too long ago, probably within the last 10 years, I had a manager who's like told me, he's like, I literally do not know what you're thinking because you don't show anything. And that was another thing that kind of stuck with me because he's like, are you struggling with anything? Are you like, what are you feeling? Because you're not showing it. And so I think it's a natural reaction to so many like different trauma survivors and like something that you might like not even realize until maybe someone brings it to your attention. And I think a lot of our listeners might be able to relate to that. And something else I kind of wanted to touch on a little bit is the struggle that you had with acute depression, PTSD. And I think a lot of these things end up manifesting physically, especially as we navigate life, get older. And a lot of us don't think about it. We think about it's the mental component that we're struggling with, our mental health, but it really translates a lot into our physical health as well. Can you tell about how that impacted you later on physically as you got older?
Yeah, I had come to realize that I had suffered depression all my life, even as a child. I mean, you look at my grade school pictures and you could see that is just not a happy kid. It is interesting that you talk about that we couldn't express our emotions. Well, I came to know that energy, that sadness, frustration, even anger that you have to hold inside of yourself will manifest itself somewhere else. I mean, it's in the same way people get ulcers from stress. Well, mine showed in my feet. I'm 67 years old, so it's been over 40 years that I've had pain in both feet. And doctors, podiatrists, every sort of healer you can imagine. I've been to pain clinics that could not find anything. physically wrong. So that did lead me to believe, in some circles, they say a lot of your pain is in your mind. And I remember working with one therapist. She said, your feet are literally telling you, I can't stand it anymore, or I don't want to go forward, or I don't want to go on. So my pain of childhood was literally translating, I can't stand it. Because otherwise, physically, doctors couldn't find anything and still can't.
Yeah, and that can be really, really frustrating. And I know for me, I had something similar about 5 or 6 years ago. I kept going to the doctor because I was having these stomach issues and I was so convinced there was something wrong. And then when they couldn't find anything, it just got really, really frustrating. And ultimately, it was concluded that I have IBS, or otherwise known as irritable bowel syndrome, which I guess has been linked to anxiety. And it's like when we're young, especially, we feel like we're just so resilient. I know, like, I think for me, this kind of onset when I was in my mid 20s or so. And we just don't really think about that physical component until it happens to us. And more recently for me, I've had to be like more in tune with managing my stress because of that, because I'll notice some physical effects and I'm like, okay, I got to slow down because if I have like a certain gut reaction to something, or if I have a certain flare up, it's generally like linked to some sort of stressor. So I feel like it's just like requires us to be like more consciously aware of some of these things that we might be, these stimuli that we're going through. Thinking about that, you mentioned also that anger mismanagement is a recurring theme in your book. Can you share a part of your memoir that highlights your journey in dealing with anger?
I think at that time, I remember my daughter Natalia she was in junior high, and I don't even remember what I was mad about. I know it was probably maybe she didn't even hear what I said, or I really don't know, but it was nighttime and she went to bed, and I was so angry that I threw shoes at the adjoining wall to her bedroom. And I would throw them as hard as I could, like I was a major league pitcher. And then I would go pick up the shoes, walk back, throw them again. And it was like I did it until I was dead tired. I had so much anger. And to this day, I don't even know what that was about. I was just angry, and of course, the effect it had on my daughter. Here's this dad throwing shoes at the wall for who knows why. Oh man, I was just basically out of my mind. So yeah, that's just one of them. Even when I was married, my wife had to hold me back from just getting into people's faces. And she would just start shoving me and say, leave him alone. And I was so angry at the world, I was looking for fights. And so anything I interpreted as a slight, I wanted to get to fight. So yeah, thank God that's over.
Yeah, I appreciate you that you shared that. And I love that the relationship between you and your daughter Natalia is such a significant part of your memoir. And it really brought actually me to tears as I read throughout your book. And it's just such a profound message. And I love that both of you were able to connect. Can you describe the moment that you might have realized that your behavior was affecting her, and what changes did you document making afterwards?
I remember, again, she was in junior high and she'd go to school, and after school, we'd make a meal and sit down for dinner. And I remember her just sitting there while she was eating, just looking at her plate, not making eye contact with me. And I said to her, why aren't you talking? And I was irritated because it was like totally ignoring me. And then she looked at me when I said, "Why aren't you talking?" And I could see fear in her eyes and on her face. And it made me think, why is she so afraid of talking to me? Well, it made me remember that I hated when my dad talked to me. He'd ask me questions and I was afraid too, because I knew whatever I said, he'd criticize me or get mad. And it felt like an interrogation every time he talked to me. And I thought, oh man, this is just like me and my dad, and I'm doing to my daughter what was done to me. And it reminded me of when I was a teenager, when I get the emotional brunt of my dad and his physicality. And even as a teenager, I remember saying to myself, if I ever have kids, I will not do to them what was done to me. And yet here it was happening with my daughter.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that with us. And it's interesting because I'll share a quick similar story because I remember before my brother and I were born, my mom had mentioned something similar. And to an extent, like she made different choices than her own parents. Her dad, which my grandfather was abusive towards her more so than my aunt. But I think she also had kids pretty young too. And so I think that was a factor. And even though there are some choices that were made for the better, there was still like a lot of issues that were still kind of like projected onto my brother and I. And so I think it's like not until actually more recently, like now, because my mom and I still kind of talk about it, like we're still trying to improve our relationship. And I think that's what touched me so much about reading your book, because I feel like it's something that actually I'm in the process of going through like myself with my own parents. And so I really love kind of reading that story of success and redemption and kind of knowing there's that light at the end of the tunnel. And so in your book, you talk about your determination to give Natalia a better life. Can you maybe recount a specific event where you really felt like you made significant progress as a father?
Yeah, she attended Biola University in Orange County, and I had visited her down in Southern Cal during a Father's Day weekend. And on our way to breakfast in the car, she turns to me and she says, a lot of my friends don't even talk to their dads. They don't have good relationships with their fathers. They don't even get together on Father's Day. And that to me was like, oh my, she realizes that we have a good relationship and that I've tried hard to save our relationship. And that Father's Day meant something to her, especially compared to her friends. And that just made it all worth it because I tried so hard just to have a relationship with my daughter that I ruined it for us during her upbringing. And I did everything I could to save it. So that was very encouraging, very satisfying, and it made it all worth it.
Absolutely love that. And that it gives like for me and so many others hope that there is possibility for change because especially for navigating any difficult relationships with our fathers or with our parents. And for so many folks, it is a very difficult, like Mother's Day, Father's Day can be very difficult. And I love that you reached such a turning point for the better. And it's just so inspiring for so many people, including myself. You talk about the path to forgiveness being central to your story and being one of faith. How did you narrate the process of forgiving your father within your memoir? And what are some of maybe the key moments of realization?
I think the key moment in my story was when I had gotten mad at my daughter and she called her mom and her mom came over and she cried to her mom and said, whatever I do is not good enough. And they left after that. And I don't ever remember crying so hard in my life because it was echoing what I felt about my dad, that whatever I did was not good enough. And despite all my efforts not to do to my daughter what was done to me, it was happening. And I couldn't deal with it, that I had failed not only myself, but I failed my daughter and I had become my dad. I still remember the tears just streaming from my eyes. It was like a water faucet was like partially on. And I sank to my knees and pleaded to God. And I said, I can't do this anymore. I said to God, my own will is not enough. I can't do it anymore. And all I said was, please help me. That was probably my rock bottom moment in my life, realizing I'd become my father.
Yeah, absolutely. And can you tell us a little bit about how you may have started to overcome this dark time in your life? And I love that throughout your memoir, it really illustrates how faith is really core to your path to forgiveness. Can you tell us a little bit about that time where you're able to kind of move forward after that?
Yeah, after that particular incident, I was at my lowest and I was making a plan to commit suicide. I remember it was the next week at work and it was common for me just to be by myself. And I would go to a park and just sit by myself at lunchtime, thinking about killing myself. And then I felt this warmth kind of overcome me. It was like a spring day and it was already warm, but it was a different kind of warmth that descended on me. And it felt like, I'm sure it was in my head, but it felt like audibly I heard someone say, you're going to be all right. And then I'm like looking around like, who said that? And I worked downtown in Sacramento and there were a few churches I was aware of. And I would go to these churches and there was never a service there and the doors were open. And I would just sit in a pew at a few of them. And because I was like, was that you, God, that said that? And I don't know, it was a day or two later after that, I'm at home and my daughter was living with her mom then. And because I was too, I don't know, I was just not in a good place for her to be with me. And I noticed something different and I couldn't put my finger on it. And I had realized that my depression was gone. And me, like I said, I'd been depressed since childhood. And actually here I am in my 50s. And you realize with depression, it's with you all the time.
Yeah.
And that's what I couldn't put my finger on. It's like something's missing. And it was depression. And I remember even like looking around and checking my pockets like I'm looking for my keys. Like, what? And there was like a burden had been lifted or even a lightness about me. And, I'd always felt like if depression were going to be taken from me, it would be yanked forcibly from me because it was such a part of me. But it was so gentle that I hadn't realized that was what happened. And I felt like now that I look back on it, it was like God realized that I couldn't function with depression because really all I was doing was getting by in my life. I mean, I would try to go to work and I would use the weekends trying to get myself in the proper frame of mind to go to work the next week. And sometimes unsuccessful, and I'd exhausted all my sick leave and all my vacation leave, and I was now getting docked hours for missing time because I was too depressed to get out of bed. And yet now I look at it, God knew that, and He knew that if I was going to write a book, I couldn't do it with depression.
It's interesting that you mentioned that because I know for so many different writers, and I like that you mentioned that because I know for me, like being able to write depends on like what kind of mood I am in. It's going to dictate like what kind of story I'm going to write. And I feel like for so many writers, it might differ because like for me, it's interesting because in some of my darkest times, it actually would be some of the time where I'm like inspired to write, but I think also as a method of therapy, but it would also dictate like what type of story I'm going to write. It might be like dark, or in some instances, it might be like a type of story that is something that I'm going to want to immerse myself in to feel better. So in a way that was kind of like therapy, but I feel like the mood that I'm in has sometimes dictated the type of story I'm going to write. So I really appreciate that you shared that with us because it just shows that it really is going to depend on the writer. And in your case, you were able to be able to share your story with us. And you also mentioned the path to forgiveness being central to your story. And I know for so many folks, especially who have been dealt at the hand of trauma from their parents, really might struggle with this, like a relationship with their parents. How did you narrate the process of forgiving your father in your memoir? What kind of moments of realization did you have? And do you have any maybe words of advice for anyone who might be going through something similar?
Yeah, for me, the key was realizing that I could no more help doing what I did to my daughter than I believe my dad couldn't help himself either. I mean, I behaved terribly around my daughter, and it was difficult for her to grow up with someone like me. And I didn't want to do that, what I was doing. I couldn't help it, yet that was how I grew up. It was the only thing I knew, was the only emotion we had when I grew up was anger, and that was all I knew. I had never said any encouraging words to her, never complimented her, never hugged her, because that's what happened to me. And I didn't want that for my daughter, yet I couldn't help it. And I think I had to realize I don't think my dad could help it either. It made me think 99% he had a worse childhood than even I had. And maybe that's all he knew. And maybe he tried the best he could. And that was the path to forgiveness for me, in realizing that he couldn't help it like I couldn't help it. So in realizing that in this life, it's hard. I mean, he came from the Philippines, and I know what a hard life that has been there. And when he came here, he worked in the fields. And yet I'd already known that he seemed to be an educated man, prideful man. But to come to America and work in the fields where we'd work for, back then, 10 cents a box, that allowed me to start forgiving him.
Yeah, I love that. And I love your messaging is so powerful there because I feel like when we humanize our parents in a way and have those like kind of like the sympathetic lens on and understanding, I think as children, sometimes as we grow older, when we realize our parents are inherently flawed, sometimes it could be very difficult, but it is something that is very necessary on a humanistic level. And I think it's also important to realize is when we're thinking about this. And I like how you mentioned, you know, thinking about our parents, like they're doing the best that they can with what they know. And that's something that actually I personally have been trying to put into practice as well. But also, of course, keeping in mind that thinking that that doesn't necessarily mean that their actions were right. But I love that you mentioned that when we think about our parents, it's like in their mind, they're doing the best they can with what they know and being able to use that as a practical application to make different choices. And I think that's something that is really helpful for folks, especially if they're on like a journey, a similar journey to forgiveness, or maybe trying to repair or reconcile a relationship with their parents. And so, kind of thinking about that and writing your book, were there any specific insights that you might have learned or gained about yourself that maybe you hadn't realized before writing it?
People have given me feedback about my book, and some of the comments I received was, despite everything that I went through, I didn't seem to write about it out of bitterness or resentment or anger. And it was only, I wrote it like, this is what happened. And I think I had realized from those comments that the circumstances at that time made me angry, but I'm not an angry person. And I think by nature, I try to be kind and to people. And sometimes when I think about it, I think God kept my heart good. I mean, some people have said, people like you find them in prison because they've lashed out in anger at the world or at someone. But all I did was just write my story. And this is a story of what happens to people from that background. And I was able to keep my sense of self, of my belief that I was a good person. I was able to keep that intact.
I love that you mentioned kind of separating out feeling angry due to your circumstances versus being an angry person. And I think a lot of times we can get caught up in what's called like a victim mentality. And sometimes we carry that with us as feeling like we're a perpetual victim of this thing and we're not able to overcome it. And I think sometimes we can also feel different types of shame. I know for me personally, like, for example, like many like young people, maybe we might make bad choices in one area or another. And so oftentimes we associate like these specific decisions. Well, I made this bad decision. That means I'm a bad person. And so I love that how you kind of separated like the behavior from yourself and thinking about the anger in terms of the circumstances and not you as a person. And so I think that's really important. Something that our listeners really should take away, that this thing that we're feeling isn't something that's going to define us. And it may have impacted us, may have shaped us along the way, but it shouldn't define us. And so I love that you share that with us. And kind of thinking back about your memoir, I actually was looking on Amazon, looking at some of the reviews that you have. Was there any feedback or reviews that you've received from readers since the publication that really stands out?
Yeah. Speaking of Amazon, and I don't know how profound it was for me, but I remember reading one of my Amazon reviews early on, and it in bold it said, one of the best books I've ever read. I had tears in my eyes when reading this, and although I'm a female and not Filipino, I'm Irish American, I could relate to so many things that he wrote in his book, and she said I brought her to tears. And I think what got to me was, I have no idea who this person is or where she lives, how old she is, or anything about her, yet my book touched her to the point where she said it was one of the best she'd ever read. And I thought, wow, this book does that to people. It just made me think, I don't know, just made me shake my head like I had no idea my writing could be that powerful, or even my life experiences could affect people in a certain way.
Yeah, that's something that I actually really love about your book because I feel like it has that impact to touch, as you're mentioning, a variety of different audiences and kind of bring some unity in a way to where these traumatic experiences can really bring us together and really brings that, I want to say, of course, that sympathy and empathy towards one another. But I think having a lot of these core elements, such as I love the father daughter relationship within your story. There's so many different elements that I think there's something that pretty much anyone can relate to. And that's what I really love about it. Is there any particular message that you might hope readers will take away from some of the final chapters of your book?
Yeah, I think simply, I didn't think my life transformed until God changed it. And I was in my mid 50s. And so I guess to me, despite past traumas, you can still have a happy life. And also, I think one of the messages is forgiveness may not look like what you expect it to look like, but it is still forgiveness. And I think in the end, I think I try to show that God redeems your life. He turned mine around. Those might be some simple themes one could get from the book.
I love that. And I also love how you mentioned forgiveness because I think there are so many different layers and so many different ways people can perceive like how to forgive. You hear commonalities like, forgive but not forget. And I think for me, and I've heard this one quite a bit, and I think it makes sense, especially how you presented it in your memoir, is that forgiveness is not necessarily for that other person in question, but it's really like for ourselves, for our own peace, for our own ability to let go, being able to move forward with our lives. And I think that's so crucial. And depending on the person in question, and in your case, if they're no longer around, or maybe it's someone that is still around, that even if we forgive them, if that's not necessarily going to change our relationship, it at least can help us be able to move forward and let go and for our own mental health. So I really appreciate that you mentioned that. And I think so many people oftentimes get stuck and I don't want to forgive this person. What they did was horrible to me. And I think it's valid, but I think it is true that forgiveness is really for us. What that other person does or doesn't do with it is something that I guess is within our control. So I love that you mentioned that. And at this point in time, I know your book came out back in 2022. Do you have any plans to write a follow-up, or are there any other writing projects that you might be considering?
I'm asked that all the time because people really liked my book and they feel I'm a talented writer. But frankly, I'm retired. When you read my book, I think people realize what a difficult life I led just to survive. And when I look at it now at 67 years old, it's like, I don't need to work anymore. I just want to enjoy the rest of my life. I like to write, but I don't find it enjoyable. I find it satisfying, but it's not anything I really like to do because a lot of it can be hard work and it's a very solitary endeavor. And the new me is not a solitary person. I enjoy being out among people, which is a complete 180 from how I grew up, from being a loner and wanting to be left alone. And now I just want to have fun the rest of my life. So that's what I'm doing.
That's so touching, and it's interesting because I know for me, I've been like kind of writing a long time, and I know this deviates from our rubric a little bit. And I know for me, most of my writing has been like short stories, very like fiction based, and I've had like this plot in mind for actually a couple of different stories, and some of it I've put on paper. I'm wondering if you have any words of advice or wisdom for anyone who might be trying to start a book, and maybe if you're getting that dreaded like writer's block and you're hoping to eventually be published. I've heard a variety of different advice from so many different authors, and I think one thing that kind of really stuck with me was you just have to just sit down and do it, whether you're kind of feeling in the mood for it or not, in order to get it done, because that motivation is kind of going to ebb and flow. But I'm curious to hear what your take on that is.
I like that you said sometimes you just have to sit there and do it because
Yeah.
it is a discipline. And it's funny, my daughter would go with me and I'd go to a coffee shop and write. She'd look at me and she'd commented like, "You don't look like you're writing. All you're doing is staring." But my mind was trying to piece things together. And I had told myself, if nothing comes, sit here for an hour, type words until things start to pop. And eventually it'll come. Not every day is going to be inspired writing.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's just going to be hard work. But if you develop the discipline to do it every day or at least an hour, it'll get done. And for me, the other advice, whether you're writing fiction or nonfiction, is write what you know. Otherwise, I guess you can spend a lot of time researching and stuff like that, and that might be fun, but it's a lot of work. But for me, yeah, it's my memoir. So I know myself. I know what I went through. So I wrote what I knew.
Oh, that's so true. And it's interesting. I was actually not too long ago, I had another interviewee who's also retired and had published a book. And I'd asked him if he was planning on another book. And he actually said something very similar along similar lines, saying that he wanted to enjoy his retirement, which is totally valid. But I really appreciate your wisdom and words of advice, because I know like for me, I think it's just like sitting down and getting past that procrastination is half that battle. Because again, like, yeah, as you mentioned, if we're writing about something that requires a lot of research, it could kind of seem daunting. And it's been really inspiring to me to come across authors who have become published later on in life. Because I remember when I was younger, when I was first writing, I was in middle school, high school. And I just, at the time, I didn't have like any sort of ideas as far as writing a book. And at that time, like, oh, I'm probably never going to publish anything. But now I'm in my mid 30s and I'm like, for a little bit, I'm like, I don't know if that ship has sailed. Hearing so many people's success stories later, publishing later on in life is just so inspiring to me. It just kind of further proves the point of it's really like never too late to do anything, even if like I've had this idea in my head for the last 5 years. And even if it takes me another 5 years to finally get that full thing on paper, it's still possible. So I really appreciate it. And kind of reflecting on your journey, the completion of your book, is there any differences into how you might view your past and present self differently?
Yeah, like I mentioned, the best part of my life started when God rescued me around the age of 55 and he transformed my life. And I think he's given me the opportunity to be the person I was meant to be. I live in a senior community and I have a lot of friends. I've commonly heard people say, Pete knows everyone. And I enjoy a lot of activities like water volleyball and pickleball. And I sing karaoke and do all kinds of activities. My therapist even suggested that I may actually be an extrovert. which is hard to wrap my head around. So this is a complete turnaround from who I used to be: unhappy, by myself, angry. And my daughter and I get along famously now. So I know I'm probably not going to write much, if anything at all, but I think my end of life chapter will read, "He lived happily ever after."
Oh, I love that so much. That is so powerfully profound. And I think that is such a great way to conclude. And I want to add a few final things because I have really enjoyed reading your book, and it's again touched me and so many others as from what you were mentioning. And I appreciate you sharing that with us and sharing your story with our listeners, because I feel like there's something for anyone to be able to kind of take away from it. Anything that someone might be struggling with or going through, and your success story is just inspires so many of us. And again, I appreciate your words of wisdom in terms of writing. And it's been such a pleasure having you on this podcast. And I know our listeners are going to be so excited for it. But before we close out, would you be able to share with us where our listeners can maybe connect with you, learn more about your book, where they can purchase it?
I have a Facebook page, and it's Pete Cruz Author, and also an Instagram page, Pete Cruz Author. If anyone would like to purchase my book, I'll sign it out, and I can be reached at, I guess, through my Facebook, or email is pete@petecruz.com.
So I'll make sure I get those all included down in our show notes below. But it was amazing having you on here. So thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. It's been so inspiring for me.
I appreciate the opportunity, Valerie, and it was very much a pleasure for me also. So thank you.